Alright, so this is going to be Unit 1, Lecture for the American Colonies. This is going to be the last lecture for the chapter. So we've talked about Jamestown a lot in this chapter. Just remember that Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement. It was established in 1607. Jamestown was eventually settled with the headright system. You've already defined the headright system, but just as a reminder, the headright system was a way to get settlers over to the New World. And how they did that was by saying if you paid for your passage, for you and your family's passage over to the New World, that you would receive 50 acres once you got over into Jamestown. So 50 acres was a lot back then, and that really got a lot of people to come and settle in the New World. They survived the starving times with the help of John Smith. John Rolfe was the one who brought the first tobacco seed to the New World, and Jamestown is where Bacon's Rebellion happened, and indentured servants would eventually be replaced with African slaves, not only in Jamestown but throughout the New World. The New England colonies, so there were two original colonies in New England. The first one was the Plymouth colony, and as we learned before, it was founded by a group of people called the Puritans, and those were people who wanted to purify the Church of England. It was established in 1620. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth. They signed the Mayflower Compact on the way over, and the Mayflower Compact is looked at as one of the first forms of democracy in the colonies. The other settlement was called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was founded by Puritans in 1630, so 10 years later, and it will eventually absorb into the Plymouth colony. Their leader was named William Bradford, and he is the one who gave that speech, "A City on a Hill," making it, or he saw this colony as a model for everyone based upon religious teachings and religious backgrounds. Obviously, the people that came over in Plymouth and in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were seeking religious freedom, and there was no freedom of religion or separation of church and state in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So I guess the hypocrisy of it all is that the Puritans who broke away and traveled and settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they themselves were very strict believers, and if you did not believe what they believed or followed the same rules and laws of the church, then you were banished or kicked out. Hence why we learned about Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams being kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So that's kind of the hypocrisy of it all, is they traveled because they were not treated fairly in England, but when they got over here, they were kind of harsh to people who saw things differently than what they did. Other New England colonies that we haven't really talked a whole lot about, I just mentioned Roger Williams. He would establish the colony of Rhode Island, and he was a Puritan dissenter. There was separation of church and state, and there was religious freedom. So he did not have religious freedom in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but when he settled the Rhode Island colony, he allowed people of all religions or all different types of churches to settle in that colony. Anne Hutchinson also wound up in Rhode Island. She challenged the Puritan authority, and she fled to join Roger Williams. The other colony in the New England area was Connecticut, established by Thomas Hooker. You have more religious freedom there. A lot of people settled in Connecticut as well. There was a document called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and it was the constitution that was written for the colony of Connecticut. And some historians see it as the first written constitution in America. So what I mean by constitution is I could write a constitution for my class. A constitution is basically just a set of guidelines for setting up government or a government structure. Obviously, government structure in my classroom would be me at the top as the teacher and then students underneath me. If I wanted to have a vice teacher or an assistant teacher, I could do that. We see our Constitution as, Constitution with the big C, the Constitution of the United States of America, setting up our government and how our country should be run. Same thing here. Fundamental Orders of Connecticut was basically just a document setting up how Connecticut, the colony, should be run at the time. Native American resistance in New England. So disputes over land marks the key conflict between Native Americans and whites throughout American history. And we're going to revisit this theme throughout American history 1 and also in American history 2. So two important conflicts that happened was the Pequot War, happened in 1637. This was a conflict that happened in Connecticut where most members of the Pequot Nation were wiped out. King Philip's War occurred in 1675. This was a vicious war between the Wampanoag Indians and the Plymouth Colony. It ended Native American resistance in the New England colonies. So two important wars and interactions between the Native Americans and the colonists in New England. All right, so let's talk about the middle colonies. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn. He was a Quaker, very tolerant of all people that wanted to settle in the Pennsylvania colony. They had a very good relationship with the Native Americans, and people living in Pennsylvania had a very early opposition to slavery. New York, New Jersey colonies, taken by the English from the Dutch, and New York becomes a thriving, diverse port city, what is now Manhattan Island or New York City. Maryland, as we know, founded as a Catholic haven by George Calvert for Lord Baltimore. The Toleration Act was signed in Maryland, and it assured religious freedom. So even though it was founded at first for Catholics to come over and live, it would eventually be a colony where you could practice any religion that you wanted. And the last two colonies would be the southern colonies. There was no North or South Carolina. There was just one colony in the very beginning, and in 1663, after the restoration of Charles II, Charlestown became a key port city and was founded in 1680, so Charlestown would be named after Charles II. North and South Carolina would split in 1712, and slaves would be a key source of labor in the South due to the rice production, tobacco, and the indigo industries, where obviously farming was a huge factor in the South. The last colony would be Georgia. So Georgia was, in fact, created as a buffer to Florida. And Georgia was a very small colony at this point in time. It was founded by a gentleman by the name of James Oglethorpe in 1733. And it was originally founded as a military colony where they would ship convicts from England to Georgia where they would stay. Things were getting very overcrowded in Europe at the time, so Georgia was kind of like a holding place for convicts, and they served as a buffer between the colonies and Spanish-controlled Florida at this time. Okay. The last two that we haven't really talked about, and we're not going to, are New Hampshire and Delaware. But on the map here, you can see the 13 original colonies. Things that I'll bring attention to the map where you see the state of Maine currently. You have in parentheses Massachusetts. So the colony of Massachusetts was split into two. You have the original colony of Massachusetts, and then Massachusetts was also Maine, and then Maine would become its own colony, and then obviously its own state later on. There is no Vermont next to New Hampshire, if you notice. And if you notice, the states, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, down into Georgia, they're all like cut off. Well, that was the border at the time of the colonies, and a lot of colonists did not move past that line where that black line is. And that black line actually is a geographical feature. It is actually the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so the Appalachian Mountains run from obviously the New England colonies all the way down into the south, part of the Blue Ridge Mountains, part of the Shenandoah Valley, if you've ever heard of that. But obviously those are the Appalachian Mountains, and we'll talk about this imaginary line or this set of mountains that kind of splits the colonies. What we will splits essentially the colonies or the states in half, and then we'll talk about that in the next chapter.